The bells of St. Bartholomew's had only just fallen silent when the scream cut through the frost-thick air, sharp enough to make even the carolers outside the church falter mid-verse. Midnight Mass had ended moments earlier, the congregation spilling out into the churchyard with flushed faces and murmured blessings, scarves pulled tight against the December cold. Inside the vicarage, set just beyond the yew hedge, Sir Lionel Bertram lay dead, and already the crime felt wrong in a way that unsettled even those accustomed to village tragedies. Sir Lionel had been found in the small study adjoining the vicarage parlour, a room he had entered alone not 10 minutes after leaving the church. The door was locked from the inside. The window, narrow and leaded, was shut and latched, its sill dusted with an unbroken frosting of snow. When the vicar and 2 parishioners forced the door, they discovered Sir Lionel slumped in his armchair, head tilted as if asleep, a neat wound just below his left ear. There was no weapon in the room, no sign of struggle, no overturned furniture, not even a smear of blood beyond the faint darkening of his collar. Death, the doctor would later say, had been swift. The village constable, red-faced from cold and confusion, was the first to declare the situation impossible. Locked rooms were things one read about, not things that occurred in St. Bartholomew's on the hill, where everyone knew everyone else's habits, grudges, and Christmas plans. Sir Lionel was not a popular man. His disputes over land boundaries and charitable bequests were well known, but he was predictable. He attended midnight mass every year, sat in the same pew, shook the same hands, and returned to the vicarage for a glass of port before walking home. Tonight, he had excused himself earlier than usual, complaining of a headache and asking to rest in the study until it passed. What truly puzzled everyone was what lay on the small writing desk beside him, a single silver bell, no larger than a child's ornament, its handle wrapped with a strip of red ribbon. It was not a church bell, nor did it belong to the vicarage decorations, all of which had been carefully inventoried by the vicar's wife only that morning. The bell was cold to the touch and utterly silent. There were no fingerprints that could be lifted with the crude methods available, and no one could say how it had come to be there. Some whispered it was a prank, others a threat misplaced, but none could explain why Sir Lionel would have it with him, or why it would be placed so deliberately by his right hand. Suspicion naturally fell upon those nearest. Mrs. Hawthorne, the vicar's sister, had been seen arguing with Sir Lionel in the church porch about a donation he had withdrawn at the last moment. Young Edward Mills, the choirmaster, had reason to resent him over a disputed legacy promised and then denied. Even the vicar himself endured a brief, uncomfortable examination, though his grief appeared genuine and his alibi, at least in theory, unassailable. Everyone had been in the church together, singing "O Come, All Ye Faithful," when the murder must have occurred, yet time itself refused to cooperate. The doctor estimated Sir Lionel's death to have occurred within a narrow window of 5 minutes after he entered the study. Those 5 minutes overlapped perfectly with the final hymn. No one had left their pew, no footsteps had been heard in the corridor, no door had opened or closed. The snow beneath the study window remained pristine, mocking any suggestion of escape or intrusion. It was as if death itself had slipped in unseen, rung a silent bell, and vanished. By dawn, the vicarage was thick with unease and half-formed theories, each more elaborate than the last. The silver bell was locked away as evidence, though it explained nothing. The locked door, the spotless window, the choir singing in perfect ignorance, each detail tightened the knot rather than loosening it. Somewhere everyone felt was a simple explanation hiding behind an assumption no one had thought to question, and, as word spread beyond the village, there were those who quietly hoped that someone with a talent for noticing small, easily dismissed details might soon take an interest in a Christmas murder that refused to make sense. It was late morning before the quiet rhythm of the village was disturbed again, this time not by bells or screams, but by the arrival of Miss Jane Marple, who stepped down from the bus with a knitted scarf drawn neatly around her neck and an expression of mild interest rather than alarm. She had come, ostensibly, to spend Christmas with her old friend Mrs. Hawthorne, and if the presence of policemen and the lingering smell of extinguished candles surprised her, she showed no sign of it. Villages, Miss Marple often reflected, were remarkably alike when it came to human behaviour, whether one lived in them or merely visited. She was taken to the vicarage at once, ushered into the same parlour where Sir Lionel had sipped his port only hours before his death. The room had been tidied with the anxious efficiency of those trying to erase a shock, yet Miss Marple's eyes moved gently from chair to mantel to carpet, absorbing details without haste. She listened as the constable explained the facts again, his voice firm but threaded with frustration. Locked door, closed window, no weapon, no possible suspect. An unfortunate mystery at Christmas. Quite so, Miss Marple murmured, her gaze drifting toward the study door, now standing open. And people say nothing ever happens in quiet places. She asked to see the room, and the constable, indulging what he clearly considered a harmless elderly lady, allowed it. The study was small and orderly, the air faintly tinged with pipe smoke and lavender polish. Miss Marple did not approach the chair at once. Instead, she paused at the threshold, noting how the door opened inward, how the latch caught with a soft click when pushed gently. She touched it lightly, as if memorizing the feel. Only then did she step inside, moving toward the desk. The bell had been removed, but the faint indentation where it had rested remained visible on the blotter. Miss Marple bent closer, peering at the fibres. "Pressed down," she said softly. "Not dropped. Someone placed it carefully," the constable shrugged. "Could be the victim himself." "Could be," Miss Marple agreed, though her tone suggested the idea lacked conviction. She straightened and glanced at the armchair. Sir Lionel's body had been taken away, yet the position of the chair remained unchanged. Miss Marple noted its angle, slightly turned away from the desk, as if the occupant had not been working but waiting. Waiting, she thought, implied expectation. Voices drifted in from the parlour, and Miss Marple recognised Mrs. Hawthorn's clipped tones, brittle with fatigue. When she joined them, "Shh!" found the vicar's sister insisting, with unnecessary emphasis, that she had never owned such a bell, and had no idea how it came to be there. Miss Marple watched her face rather than listening to her words. It was not fear she saw, but irritation, as though Mrs. Hawthorn resented the bell for reasons she did not quite wish to name. Later, Miss Marple took tea with the vicar's wife, who apologised repeatedly for the disruption to what should have been a peaceful holiday. As cups were poured, Miss Marple's eyes rested on the sideboard, where a small collection of Christmas ornaments had been arranged. Among them were several bells, larger, gilt-edged, and festooned with greenery. "How charming," Miss Marple said. "Though I imagine you would notice if one went missing." "Oh, certainly," the vicar's wife replied at once. "I'm very particular. But that bell the police mentioned, it wasn't ours." "No," Miss Marple said. "No, I don't believe it was—" She asked casually about the choir, about the final hymn, about who had been standing nearest the aisle. People answered readily, relieved to speak of ordinary things. It was young Edward Mills who hesitated when she asked whether anyone had stopped singing before the end. Only a moment's pause, easily overlooked, but Miss Marple caught it. "I may have," he said finally. "Just for a second. I thought I heard something." "What sort of something?" Miss Marple asked gently. "Like a bell," he said, flushing. "But that's absurd. Bells were ringing everywhere." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied. "They were—" By afternoon she had formed no grand theory, and she said as much when the constable pressed her. "It's all very confusing," she admitted. "But then, people often confuse themselves by assuming what they think they know is correct." She returned once more to the study before dusk, standing by the window this time. Outside, the snow had begun to melt, blurring footprints and erasing the sharp certainty of the night before. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Snow, she thought, was very good at telling lies if one expected too much of it. And bells were meant to be heard. A bell that left no sound behind was seldom as innocent as it appeared. The light was already thinning when Miss Marple suggested, with polite firmness, that it might be useful to hear everyone's account once more, this time in the comfort of the vicarage parlour. There was something about the way she said it, mild, almost apologetic, that made refusal seem unreasonable. Chairs were drawn closer to the fire, cups refreshed, and one by one the familiar faces arranged themselves in a loose semicircle, each carrying a private version of the same terrible night. The constable began, notebook in hand, but it was Miss Marple who guided the conversation. She asked simple questions, often repeating ones that had already been answered, as though she were merely trying to understand rather than uncover. Mrs. Hawthorn spoke first, her voice brisk and controlled. She described her disagreement with Sir Lionel in the church porch, emphasizing its triviality, insisting it had ended on a perfectly civil note. Miss Marple nodded, fingers folded in her lap, and asked her to repeat exactly where she had been standing when the final hymn began. Mrs. Hawthorn answered promptly, perhaps too promptly, giving a location near the back pews. When later the vicar placed her closer to the aisle, she corrected him with sharp precision. The discrepancy was slight, but Miss Marple noticed how Mrs. Hawthorn's mouth tightened as she did so. Young Edward Mills was next, pale and earnest, his hands twisting together as he spoke. He confirmed his earlier statement about hearing something during the hymn. "Just a momentary sound," he insisted. "I thought it was my imagination." The bells were ringing outside. "And inside?" Miss Marple asked. "No," he said quickly. "No bells inside. Of course not." She let that pass and asked him about Sir Lionel. Edward spoke of disappointment, of promises made and broken, but his tone was resigned rather than angry. Yet when Miss Marple inquired whether he had seen Sir Lionel leave the church, Edward hesitated again. "I think so," he said. "Or perhaps I only assumed it. People were moving about." Assumptions, Miss Marple thought, were cropping up everywhere. The vicar himself answered with weary honesty, recounting his brief conversation with Sir Lionel and his surprise at finding him dead so soon after. He was careful with his words, careful to place himself in full view of the congregation during the hymn. Miss Marple believed him, though she noted how often he glanced toward his sister as he spoke, as if silently checking that his recollection matched hers. Others were questioned in turn, a parishioner who claimed to have stepped outside for air, only to be gently reminded by another that she had remained inside the entire time, a churchwarden who insisted the study door had always been temperamental, though the vicar later said it had been repaired months ago. None of these contradictions were dramatic, but they formed a faint, unsettling pattern, like misaligned stitches in a familiar tapestry. Miss Marple listened more than she spoke, her attention wandering at moments when answers became rehearsed, sharpening when someone strayed from expectation. She noticed who volunteered extra details and who answered only what was asked. Mrs. Hawthorn, for instance, offered unnecessary assurances of her innocence, while Edward Mills seemed anxious to downplay his own presence near the aisle. The constable wrote diligently, yet it was clear he was still seeking a single decisive inconsistency rather than the accumulation of small ones. At one point, Miss Marple asked whether anyone had touched the bell before it was taken away. There was a pause. The vicar's wife shook her head. Edward frowned, uncertain. Mrs. Hawthorn said crisply that she had not even seen it until the police mentioned it. Miss Marple thanked them and changed the subject, though she could not help noticing that Mrs. Hawthorn's denial came a fraction too fast, as though prepared in advance. When the questioning finally drew to a close, the room felt heavier, not lighter, as if each account had added another layer rather than stripping one away. The constable excused himself to compare notes, leaving Miss Marple alone with the fire and her thoughts. Voices, she reflected, were very revealing things. What people chose not to say often mattered far more than what they did. She rose and crossed to the sideboard, her eyes once again drawn to the Christmas ornaments. One of the larger bells had been shifted since earlier, turned so that its clapper was visible. Miss Marple touched it lightly. It rang, clear and bright, filling the parlour with sound. Several heads turned sharply. "How loud," Miss Marple said mildly. "One would certainly notice it, even during a hymn." Mrs. Hawthorn's face flushed. "I don't see what that proves." "Not much," Miss Marple replied. "Not by itself." She returned to her chair, folding her hands once more, beneath the polite exchanges and careful recollections. She sensed a shared, unspoken understanding among them. Someone in that room knew more than they were admitting. The bell, the locked door, the 5-minute window, each witness had shaped these facts to suit their own comfort. Miss Marple felt certain now that the deception was not in one grand lie, but scattered among many small ones, waiting patiently to be gathered together. The fire burned lower as evening settled, and with it came the subtle shift that Miss Marple had learned to recognize, the moment when people, having said all they intended to say, began to betray themselves in quieter ways. She remained in the parlour while the others drifted in and out, and in those small comings and goings she began to trace the invisible threads connecting them. Sir Lionel's affairs, she discovered, were a source of remarkably widespread unease. Over a light supper, the vicar spoke of the recent revision to Sir Lionel's will, mentioning it only because Miss Marple asked after the practical consequences of his death. The old man had altered several bequests in the past year, sometimes promising generously, sometimes withdrawing just as suddenly. The choir funds Edward Mills had mentioned were one such case. Mrs. Hawthorne's charitable committee had been another. Even the church roof repairs had been delayed when Sir Lionel decided, without explanation, that his money would be better used elsewhere. Greed alone, Miss Marple reflected, rarely operated in isolation. It mingled easily with wounded pride and fear of loss. She asked Edward whether Sir Lionel had given a reason for retracting his support. Edward shook his head. He said only that circumstances had changed. "What circumstances?" Miss Marple asked. "I never knew," Edward replied, though his eyes flickered away. Later, she learned from the vicar's wife that Edward had recently applied for a post elsewhere, one that would have been secured had Sir Lionel honoured his promise. Disappointment again, but disappointment could sharpen into something more dangerous under the right pressure. Mrs. Hawthorne's motives were equally complex. Her argument with Sir Lionel had not been about money alone, but about influence. She had relied on his patronage to maintain her standing in several charitable circles, and his sudden withdrawal threatened not just her projects, but her sense of authority. Miss Marple observed how often Mrs. Hawthorne spoke of what people would think, as though reputation were a tangible possession. Fear, Miss Marple thought, of becoming smaller in other people's eyes could drive extraordinary behaviour. Even the vicar was not entirely free of entanglement. Sir Lionel owned a strip of land adjoining the churchyard, land the vicar had long hoped to acquire for expansion. Negotiations had stalled, tempers had flared, and though nothing overtly hostile had followed, Miss Marple sensed the quiet resentment of a man accustomed to patience being tested. Yet she dismissed him quickly as a likely culprit. His motives lacked the urgency that violence required. Alibis were examined again, this time not as absolutes but as fragile constructions built on shared assumptions. Everyone relied on the final hymn as their shield, yet Miss Marple noted how imprecise memories became when pinned to music rather than clocks. She asked who had begun the hymn, who had finished it, who might have paused. Edward's earlier admission returned to her mind. A momentary lapse in singing could easily mask another sound, or the absence of one. The locked room, too, began to look less impregnable under scrutiny. Miss Marple had the constable demonstrate the latch once more. It caught neatly when the door was closed, but with a practised hand it could be lifted into place before shutting. Anyone leaving the room could secure it from the outside and create the illusion of an inside lock. The constable protested that this was unlikely, but Miss Marple smiled. "Unlikely things happen all the time," she said, "particularly when people believe them impossible." The bell remained the most elusive piece. Miss Marple learned, through careful inquiry, that a travelling toy seller had passed through the village earlier that week, offering small bells tied with ribbons as holiday trinkets. Several children had been given them. One such child, it emerged, was Mrs. Hawthorne's niece, visiting for Christmas. The bell on the desk might have been dismissed as meaningless, yet its deliberate placement suggested intent. Not a signal, perhaps, but a reminder, or a warning. As Miss Marple sorted these details, she began to see how the motives overlapped rather than contradicted one another. Money, reputation, thwarted ambition, all pressed upon the same narrow window of opportunity after midnight mass. Someone had known Sir Lionel would step into that study. Someone had known the hymn would cover a brief absence. And someone had been confident enough to rely on others' certainty that no crime could occur under such circumstances. By the time the household settled for the night, Miss Marple felt the shape of the deception more clearly, though its centre remained hidden. Each suspect had a reason to wish Sir Lionel gone, but only one would have combined motive with opportunity and the foresight to exploit everyone else's assumptions. The maze of motives was narrowing, its paths converging toward a single point. Miss Marple, knitting quietly by the fire, allowed herself a small, thoughtful smile. The bell had rung after all, just not in the way anyone expected. The next morning the village awoke to a flurry of activity that seemed disproportionate to the season. The constable, having received word of a discovery in a neighbouring town, returned with an air of triumph. A small silver bell, identical to the one found in Sir Lionel's study, had been traced to a travelling salesman who had sold it to Edward Mill's cousin. The connection appeared immediate, tangible, and, to the constable's mind, decisive. Edward had purchased the bell only days earlier, ostensibly for decoration, yet now it seemed inextricably linked to the murder. The vicarage was soon a whirlwind of excitement. Reporters, curious villagers, and even a few distant relatives arrived to hear the good news. Edward, pale but composed, was taken aside by the constable and questioned again. Under pressure, he admitted to having handled the bell earlier in the week and, inadvertently, to forgetting to mention the exact time he last saw it. The police interpreted this as a confession of opportunity, and whispers of guilt began to circulate before the words had fully settled. Case closed, the constable declared publicly, with a triumphant puff of breath that suggested he felt entitled to a hero's welcome. Miss Marple, observing from her corner near the window, sipped her tea with a patient calm. She said nothing, though the sharp crease between her brows betrayed her unease. Edward's involvement explained a small part of the puzzle, yes, the bell, but it did not explain the method, the precision of timing, or the impossibility of the locked door, nor did it account for Mrs. Hawthorne's agitation when the bell was first mentioned, or for the fleeting hesitation in Edward's own testimony when asked about the final hymn. Something, Miss Marple felt, remained hidden behind the surface of apparent evidence. Even as Edward was taken to the station for further questioning, she wandered back into the study, her fingers trailing lightly over the desk. The indentation left by the bell seemed to mock the superficial resolution. If Edward had placed it there, why so meticulously, and why at that exact spot? A child's bell, a mere decoration, yet it had become the centerpiece of a murder mystery. The simplicity of the explanation, Miss Marple thought, made it all the more suspicious. Criminals, she had learned long ago, often relied on the tendency of others to embrace convenience over truth. By afternoon, the vicarage had calm. Leaving Miss Marple alone with her thoughts and the faint smell of pipe tobacco lingering in the study. She revisited each witness's account, quietly replaying the contradictions, Mrs. Hawthorne's insistence that she had never seen the bell until police mentioned it, Edward's brief falter over hearing something during the hymn, and the vicar's careful attention to the positioning of his sister in the pews. Each inconsistency was minor, almost trivial, yet collectively they formed a pattern that refused to align with the theory the constable had embraced. Miss Marple decided to take a walk through the village. The crisp winter air cleared her mind, and she observed the ways in which people moved, spoke, and avoided certain questions. Even the smallest gestures, she knew, could betray the invisible burden of guilt. When she passed the churchyard, she paused to inspect the snow beneath the study window, noting the absence of any fresh footprints that would connect the study to the outside. Edward's supposed handling of the bell did not reconcile the locked door, nor did it explain the timing of the murder. Whoever had killed Sir Lionel had relied on misdirection, on the expectation that others would leap to the most convenient conclusion, and so far they had succeeded. That evening, as the vicarage settled once more into a quiet domestic rhythm, the constable came to her with a cordial nod. "Well, Miss Marple," he said, "it seems we've solved it. Edward admits he handled the bell, and the evidence matches. It's as simple as that." Miss Marple shook her head gently. "Simple, perhaps," she murmured. "But truth is rarely so obliging. You see, a bell may ring, yet it need not tell the whole story. One can be too eager to celebrate a solution, especially when the true design of events remains unseen." The constable frowned, unsure whether she was praising or criticizing H. Miss Marple allowed a faint smile. She had learned to trust the rhythm of human behavior, to follow the quiet signals beneath words and actions. And tonight, something in the village hummed beneath the surface, a silent presence waiting, patient and clever, biding its time. The case might appear closed, the suspect arrested, but Miss Marple knew that a true criminal did not reveal themselves in haste. Somewhere, in the shadows of St. Bartholomew's on the hill, the architect of Sir Lionel's death remained unobserved, ready to complete the design they had so carefully laid. Miss Marple spent the following morning quietly in the parlour, observing the village from the vicarage window while the frost clung stubbornly to the eaves. The snow had begun to soften, yet the tracks left in the courtyard were still visible enough to suggest a careful hand, or perhaps someone very familiar with the terrain. Her thoughts wandered to the bell, to Edward's faltering testimony, and to the subtle tension that lingered among the household. Something, she was certain, had been overlooked entirely, a detail so familiar that it had been dismissed as ordinary. Her curiosity led her to the vicar's library, a small room lined with rows of modest volumes and local records. She asked the vicar politely if she might look through the parish archives, ostensibly for historical research. While he busied himself with tea, she rifled through old minutes of committee meetings, ledgers, and letters tied together with faded ribbon. It was in one of these letters, from nearly 20 years prior, that a small, seemingly inconsequential note caught her eye, a brief mention of a dispute between Sir Lionel and Mrs. Hawthorne over a legacy, a disagreement that had been publicly smoothed over at the time, yet left its trace in the careful phrasing of the correspondence. The wording was almost apologetic. If the writer feared more than simple disagreement, it was a fear rooted in personal history. The realization struck Miss Marple slowly, like a shadow creeping across the floor. The past was entwined with the present in ways that villagers seldom admitted. Mrs. Hawthorne and Sir Lionel had clashed before, long before Christmases and charity committees, over money and influence, yes, but more deeply over reputation and perceived slights. It was a pattern repeated quietly, measured in letters, small public quarrels, and exchanges of favours and reproofs. And, as Miss Marple suspected, Edward Mills's recent disappointment and the Bell's sudden prominence were merely catalysts, not causes. The true motivation had been seeded long ago, nurtured in the soil of old grievances and subtle humiliations. She returned to the study, her eyes scanning the furniture and fixtures for evidence of human patterns rather than physical ones. The desk, the chair, the slight dent where the bell had rested, all were reminders of intent. If the murder had been committed with precision, then the plan had likely drawn upon intimate knowledge of the household, its routines, and the people within it. Miss Marple's mind ticked over the possibilities. It was one thing to handle a bell carelessly, it was quite another to place it deliberately in a way that would mislead everyone else. Whoever had done this understood timing, distraction, and expectation, and they had learned it over many years, not merely in the last few days. The connections became clearer as she revisited the statements of the witnesses. Mrs. Hawthorne's defensiveness, Edward's hesitation, the vicar's careful positioning of himself, all formed a subtle lattice. But more than that, the older letters revealed shared history, alliances, and grievances that the constable had no reason to suspect. A public confrontation might have seemed trivial, but the private ramifications were long-standing. Miss Marple realized that the motives were interwoven, like the threads of a tapestry, the incident with the bell, the brief falter during the hymn, and the rushed solution. With Edward as the apparent culprit, were mere surface phenomena. The real design had been built over decades of careful attention to human behavior. She paused by the window again, noting the way the shadows lengthened across the courtyard. The past, she mused, often waits quietly until a particular moment arrives to manifest itself. It was not greed alone, nor jealousy, nor disappointment in recent events. Those were tools, instruments to be wielded by someone familiar with the vulnerabilities of others. Miss Marple understood, with a quiet thrill of certainty, that she had found the point where history and opportunity intersected. A single, overlooked detail, one line in a letter, one carefully maintained habit, linked the present crime to a long-forgotten dispute, and only by following it could the true culprit be revealed. She returned to the parlour just as Edward was brought back from the station, released under supervision yet still pale and uneasy. The constable, smiling as if victory had already been secured, detailed the official conclusion, praising the detective work of local police. Miss Marple, knitting quietly, allowed the conversation to wash over her. The surface was neat and tidy, the facts arranged into a convincing narrative, but beneath it lay the intricate, carefully cultivated shadow of the past, waiting for recognition. And Miss Marple, as always, had the patience to wait until the shadows were ready to speak. Miss Marple had spent the morning quietly observing the household, noting the rhythm of movements and the subtleties of expression as people went about their routines. There was an almost imperceptible tension that clung to the vicarage, like the lingering chill of frost in a corner that sunlight had yet to reach. While the constable focused on the tangible evidence, the bell, Edward's testimony, the sequence of events during midnight mass, S.S. Marple's mind worked along a less conventional line. She had long believed that human behavior could betray truth in ways that physical clues could not, and today she intended to put that theory to the test. She invited the household to the parlour under the pretense of a casual tea. "I have always found," she said, "that a small experiment can often illuminate matters far better than questioning alone." The vicar and Mrs. Hawthorn exchanged glances, polite but wary, while Edward shifted uneasily in his chair. Miss Marple placed the remaining silver bell on the sideboard, catching the soft afternoon light. She did not speak of it further, but allowed it to remain in sight, a silent prompt in the room. "Would anyone like to ring the bell?" she asked suddenly, with a gentle smile. "It seems a harmless enough thing, yet I have always found that people react differently when confronted with an object connected to an event that troubles them." She poured tea with careful deliberation, allowing her words to settle. The household murmured politely, as though the suggestion were quaint. No one moved. Finally, Mrs. Hawthorn cleared her throat and reached for the bell, pretending casual interest. She lifted it and let it hang, then set it down almost immediately. Her hands trembled slightly, though she quickly brushed it off, smoothing her gloves. Miss Marple noted this without comment. Edward's eyes flicked to the bell, then away, betraying a subtle unease, yet he remained still. The vicar sipped his tea in silence, eyes clouded with distraction. Miss Marple let the moment stretch, understanding that a measured pause often revealed more than words. Then she asked a deceptively simple question. "If you had seen someone place this bell here, would you recognize them?" She let the words float in the room, observing reactions closely. Edward's shoulders stiffened imperceptibly. Mrs. Hawthorn's eyes flicked to the window, a slight tightening around her lips betraying discomfort. The vicar blinked several times, avoiding eye contact with everyone. Miss Marple leaned forward, her voice soft but firm. "It is remarkable what memory retains, even when the mind attempts to suppress it. A hand, a gesture, a habit, these are difficult to conceal." She paused, letting the suggestion take root. Then she added, almost as if speaking to herself, "Sometimes the simplest objects carry the heaviest burdens of truth." The effect was immediate. Mrs. Hawthorn, who had maintained her composure for the better part of the day, set the bell down too firmly, sending it clattering against the sideboard. The sharp sound echoed through the room, drawing startled glances. She looked up quickly, forcing a smile, but her hands shook slightly, betraying a nervousness she had not allowed before. Edward shifted again, and this time he spoke without thinking. I didn't place it there," he stammered. "I only saw it earlier. I only meant—" His words trailed off, the incomplete sentences revealing his inner agitation. Miss Marple's eyes flicked between the two of them, noting the subtle cracks in their carefully maintained facades. The bell, she realized, had acted as a psychological catalyst, pressing on memory and guilt alike. The object itself was trivial, yet its significance lay in the associations it provoked, associations that could not be rehearsed or hidden completely. The silence that followed was telling. No one else spoke, and the weight of unspoken acknowledgement hung in the air. "I see," Miss Marple said softly, her voice light, almost conversational. "It is curious how even the most ordinary things can reveal extraordinary truths. One cannot help but react, even when one wishes to remain composed." She rose and walked slowly to the window, allowing her attendee on to drift to the fading light over the snow, while the household remained still, caught between propriety and the unspooling tension her exercise had elicited. By the time the constable returned from an errand, Miss Marple had already made her mental note of the reactions, storing each tremor of the hand, each falter of speech, and each diverted glance. To an ordinary observer, nothing remarkable had occurred. Yet for Miss Marple, the bell had spoken volumes. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was enough to indicate where the deception truly lay, hidden beneath layers of politeness and assumed innocence. The real story, she knew, was beginning to emerge, not in confessions or overt evidence, but in the shadows cast by human behaviour when pressed gently but decisively. The calm that had settled over the vicarage was abruptly disturbed the following morning. Miss Marple arrived in the parlour to find a mild commotion. The constable's face was flushed, his notebook clasped tightly in one hand. "Miss Marple," he began, clearly unsettled, "it seems we have a problem. The silver bell, the one we used yesterday in the parlour exercise, has disappeared." Miss Marple's brow furrowed slightly, though her voice remained measured. "Disappeared? Are you certain it was here this morning?" "Yes, absolutely certain," the constable replied. "It was placed on the sideboard just as you instructed. And now, nothing. Not a trace." He gestured helplessly toward the empty spot, and a hush fell over the room. Edward Mills shifted in his chair, pale and uncertain. Mrs. Hawthorn's hands tightened around her teacup, the rims whitening slightly under her grip. Even the vicar, usually composed, looked startled, glancing toward the window as though someone could have entered unseen. Miss Marple walked deliberately to the sideboard, inspecting the surrounding area. There were no scuff marks, a carpet. No disturbance to the ornaments nearby. The bell had vanished silently, leaving only a faint dust outline where it had rested. She turned slowly, her eyes sweeping over the faces of those present. "Well," she said softly, "it seems our friend has taken greater care than I anticipated." The constable muttered about a theft, a prank, perhaps even interference from someone seeking to protect Edward or mislead the investigation. But Miss Marple remained thoughtful. The disappearance was not random, it was deliberate. Someone had removed the bell knowing it would be noticed, knowing its absence would provoke reaction. The psychological pressure had been effective before, and now it was being manipulated further. She asked everyone to remain where they were while she considered the possibilities. Mrs. Hawthorn's posture stiffened. Edward's nervous glances flicked toward the door. The vicar fidgeted with his gloves. Miss Marple had long observed that panic, even subtle, could reveal hidden knowledge, and she watched for these slight tremors of the hand, the half-turned glance, the voice that softened or rose at unexpected moments. After a pause, she spoke. "The bell was not removed casually. The person who did this knew its significance to our little exercise. They wished to obscure it before we could gather more information. That tells me quite clearly that whoever it was is concerned about what we might learn next." She allowed her words to sink in. And concern, as we have seen, is a dangerous thing when combined with knowledge of both opportunity and motive. The vicar suggested locking down the house, checking all rooms and storage areas, while the constable agreed to retrace everyone's steps from the past 24 hours. Miss Marple accompanied him, noting how each person moved and where attention wavered. Mrs. Hawthorn lingered near the staircase, her attention darting nervously to the hallway. Edward hovered near the window, fidgeting with the cord of the curtain. The vicar stood by the fireplace, his gaze distant, as if recalling a memory he hoped to control. It was then that Miss Marple noticed something subtle, a glint under the edge of the hearthrug, barely visible in the soft morning light. Kneeling, she pulled at it gently and revealed a small corner of red ribbon, unmistakably matching the one that had adorned the bell. She held it up, letting it catch the light. "Ah," she said softly. "A clue, though not the bell itself. Someone has left a trace, perhaps carelessly, or perhaps intentionally, confident that it would mislead us." The room seemed to tense further at her words. The disappearance of the bell was not simply an act of theft. It was a statement, a challenge even, directed at those who were pursuing the truth. Miss Marple understood that the criminal was playing a sophisticated game, manipulating both evidence and psychology, to obscure the path she was following. Trust, she realized, was fragile here. Each person had reason to conceal or distort, whether out of fear, guilt, or self-interest. Yet the red ribbon, small and almost innocent, was enough to restore direction. It connected the vanished bell to someone who had moved within the parlour while avoiding notice. Miss Marple's mind worked quietly, connecting it to previous observations, the flicker of Mrs. Hawthorn's hands, Edward's hesitant admissions, the faint reactions she had seen when the bell was first discussed. Someone wanted to halt the investigation, to maintain a facade of innocence while keeping the true story buried. But small errors, tiny traces like the ribbon, would betray them. She allowed a faint, thoughtful smile as she rose. The disappearance had raised the stakes, yes, but it had also illuminated the criminal's caution, and, inadvertently, their patterns. Miss Marple understood now more clearly than ever that the game was shifting, and that the final act of revelation would demand patience, keen observation, and an ability to read the subtleties of human behavior that so many overlooked. The bell might be gone, but its absence had spoken volumes, and Miss Marple was listening carefully. The village, which had barely begun to settle after the first shock, was thrown into fresh panic that afternoon. News arrived in hurried footsteps, a scream from the vicarage kitchen, piercing and raw, followed by a metallic crash that echoed through the hallways. Miss Marple, standing by the window with her knitting still in hand, felt the familiar tightening of the chest that signalled sudden danger. Without hesitation, she moved through the corridors, her mind already calculating possibilities, her eyes alert to every detail. In the kitchen, the scene was chaotic. Pots and pans lay strewn across the floor, the small copper kettle overturned, and the cook stood trembling near the pantry door. On the tiles, sprawled unnaturally, was the body of Mr. Randall, a visiting parishioner, who had offered to help with holiday preparations. He was alive but unconscious, a dark bruise forming on the side of his head, his eyes half closed and murmuring incoherently. The constable rushed forward, calling for help, while Miss Marple examined the room with quiet scrutiny. The window was intact, the door locked as usual, and yet there were signs of struggle. Footprints smudged in flour on the tiles, a chair overturned as if to block passage. Most notable, however, was the absence of any object that might have caused the blow. Miss Marple bent to inspect the floor closely. It was too deliberate, too staged, as if the assailant wanted to create the appearance of randomness while leaving only subtle traces. "Someone is taunting us," Miss Marple murmured. Her voice carried over the worried whispers of the household. "They wish us to think this is unconnected, a mere accident. But I suspect it is anything but." Edward Mills, pale and fidgeting, had appeared in the doorway, eyes wide. It couldn't have been anyone here," he stammered. I was in the parlour. Mrs. Hawthorne, the vicar. They were with me." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Indeed, Edward, and yet someone managed to strike in a way that leaves no one certain, even for a moment, of what happened. That is no accident." The constable, visibly flustered, began taking notes frantically, trying to reconcile this new incident with the earlier murder and the vanished bell. But Miss Marple's attention was elsewhere. She noticed the subtle irregularities, the direction of the flour smears, the position of the overturned chair, and most tellingly, the faint smear of red, almost imperceptible, on the pantry latch. She crouched, brushing lightly with her fingertips. It was ribbon fibre, identical in colour and texture to the remnants she had discovered after the bell disappeared. A chill ran through her. The villain was not only clever but daring, willing to act within the household while observation was intense. This was no random attack, it was deliberate, a calculated message that the investigation had reached a point of danger. Miss Marple rose, her mind racing. Whoever had orchestrated Sir Lionel's death, and the subsequent manipulation of evidence, was several steps ahead, confident in their ability to exploit even the most mundane household activities. Mrs. Hawthorne, standing stiffly near the doorway, caught Miss Marple's gaze. There was a flicker in her eyes, quickly masked by propriety. Edward flinched at the same moment, biting his lip as if holding back speech. The vicar clasped his hands tightly, gaze lowered. Miss Marple felt the weight of their reactions like subtle currents in water. Someone's anxiety revealed knowledge that was not spoken. "I believe," Miss Marple said carefully, addressing the room, "that we are dealing with a person who understands the psychology of those around them. They anticipate actions, predict reactions, and act to obscure the truth. This is no longer simply a matter of solving a crime. We must consider prevention." The cook, who had been quiet until now, shivered and whispered of a shadow she had glimpsed, moving past the hallway outside the kitchen, just moments before the crash. Miss Marple nodded, filing this observation with her mental map of the household's routines. The new crime, whether a warning or an attempt to halt investigation, demonstrated that the stakes were higher than anyone had anticipated. As the constable arranged for Mr. Randall's care and summoned reinforcements, Miss Marple stood by the window once more, her eyes tracing every shadow across the snow-blanketed courtyard. The villain was still at large, patient, calculating, and aware of their pursuers. Every step they took was measured, every clue manipulated. Miss Marple felt the familiar thrill of the chase settle in her chest. This twist, dangerous and unexpected, had raised the game. Yet she knew that with careful observation, keen insight, and a deep understanding of human nature, the next move would be hers to make, and the shadow could no longer remain entirely unseen. The evening settled over the vicarage with a tense hush, broken only by the occasional rustle of footsteps and the soft crackle of the dying fire. Miss Marple sat quietly in her chair, knitting needles poised but unmoving, her mind sifting through the events of the past days. The first murder, the vanished bell, Edward's faltering testimony, and now the assault on Mr. Randall. All of it had seemed disconnected at first, each incident a fragment of confusion. Yet, as she replayed each moment, each subtle gesture, she began to notice an underlying rhythm, a thread that tied the seemingly random acts together. It was a trivial thing at first, a slip of the tongue by Mrs. Hawthorne during tea earlier that day. She had mentioned, almost in passing, that Sir Lionel had always been particular about the arrangement of ornaments on the sideboard in the parlour. Miss Marple had noted it at the time, but dismissed it as ordinary fussiness. Now, with the benefit of hindsight, it struck H. differently. Every incident involving the bell, every carefully staged scene, had centred on objects placed, or removed, from exactly that part of the room. The pattern was deliberate, precise, and intimately tied to the household's layout. She rose and moved to the parlour, her eyes scanning the furniture, the ornaments, and the sideboard itself. Each placement, she realised, had been calculated to attract attention while hiding the true mechanism of action. The bell had been set on the blotter in such a way that its absence, or presence, would provoke reaction without revealing the hand behind it. The subtle fibre left by the bell's removal had been overlooked only because attention had been drawn to more obvious signs. Her gaze then fell on a small, overlooked detail, the way the ribbon from the bell's handle matched a similar ribbon still tied to one of the larger decorative bells on the sideboard. A child's bell had travelled through the house, moved carefully yet deliberately to create misdirection. Miss Marple's mind clicked into place. Whoever had orchestrated this understood how people responded to familiar objects. They used expectation itself as a weapon. The bell was not merely a clue, it was a lever, applied to manipulate perception, control reactions, and conceal the true intent of the crime. She recalled Edward's hesitation during the hymn, Mrs. Hawthorne's trembling hands when handling the bell, and even the cook's fleeting sighting of a shadow in the hallway. All these fragments, now considered together, suggested someone who moved with intimate knowledge of both the household and the people in it. Each minor detail, once deemed inconsequential, was actually a piece of an elaborate psychological pattern designed to mislead observers and protect the perpetrator. Miss Marple's eyes then drifted to the fireplace hearth, where she had discovered the red rib. Born earlier, it seemed insignificant at the time, a small remnant easily dismissed. But now she understood. The ribbon had been left intentionally, a breadcrumb leading only to partial understanding, enough to distract and misdirect. Each act of the criminal was layered, the bell, the assault, the disappearance of evidence, each carefully staged, each meant to reinforce a narrative that would appear plausible to anyone lacking her scrutiny. The realization crystallized. The crimes were not haphazard. They were a performance, exploiting small habitual behaviors and minor expectations. By manipulating objects people interacted with daily, the culprit had created a web of false leads that drew the attention outward, while the real motive remained hidden. The timing of events, the placement of items, and the subtle psychological cues all pointed to one truth. The solution had been in plain sight the entire time, concealed only by the assumptions of those too eager to accept surface explanations. Miss Marple smiled faintly, a sense of clarity settling over her. She returned to her chair by the fire, knitting needles poised once more. The pattern was clear. The sequence of deliberate acts, once disjointed, now revealed a coherent strategy. The criminal had been confident, patient, and meticulous, but no one, not even someone so clever, could account for the careful, quiet observation of a mind accustomed to noticing the smallest irregularities in human behaviour. The pieces of the puzzle were aligning, and Miss Marple knew that the next steps would reveal the identity of the person who had manipulated events from the shadows with such cunning precision. Miss Marple had spent the evening quietly observing the household, letting the ordinary rhythms of domestic life unfold while her mind traced the hidden contours of motive. The firelight cast gentle shadows across the parlour, revealing small movements, Mrs. Hawthorne adjusting a cushion, Edward tapping nervously at the arm of his chair, the vicar absently straightening papers on the desk. Each action, though seemingly mundane, became a signal, a thread in the fabric of understanding she had been patiently weaving. It was the way Mrs. Hawthorne handled the ornaments, returning them to exact positions as if seeking reassurance in their order, that drew Miss Marple's attention first. She had noticed it before, of course, but now, with the pattern of events and the disappearance of the bell in mind, it revealed something more profound. The meticulousness, the insistence on control, spoke not merely of habit but of a deeper need, to dominate the perceptions of others, to orchestrate events so that she remained the unseen authority within the household. And Miss Marple, with quiet certainty, realized that this need had driven her further than anyone could have anticipated. She called the household together under the guise of reviewing the day's events, an innocent enough suggestion. As they gathered, she placed a seemingly trivial bell on the sideboard, letting its presence hover in the room without comment. The reactions were immediate. Mrs. Hawthorne's hand trembled slightly when she noticed it. Edward's gaze darted nervously toward the fire, and even the vicar's composed expression faltered for a fraction of a second. Miss Marple spoke gently, addressing no one in particular. "It seems we have all been quite concerned with appearances, have we not? The position of a bell, the timing of a hymn, the neatness of a sideboard, small details, yes, yet they weigh heavily upon those who wish to conceal more than they reveal." Her eyes rested on Mrs. Hawthorne, calm yet penetrating. "Sometimes it is not money, influence, or revenge that motivates a person to act. Sometimes it is the desire to shape the W, old to one's own vision, to ensure that no detail escapes their control." Mrs. Hawthorne's composure cracked at last, just a fraction, a sharp intake of breath, a tightening of the lips, a faint blush that spread across her cheek. Miss Marple continued, undeterred. "You have been patient, careful, and clever. You knew the study, the household, and the routines of those around you. You used what others dismissed as trivial, the bell, the placement of objects, the small distractions of everyday life, to construct an illusion. But the truth cannot be hidden behind appearances forever." Edward's fidgeting became more pronounced, though his glance toward Mrs. Hawthorne suggested confusion rather than guilt. The vicar, too, seemed to understand that the pattern Miss Marple had discerned pointed directly toward one mind, the mind that had manipulated all others, orchestrating events so that everyone else's assumptions would obscure the truth. "It was not financial gain," Miss Marple said softly, letting the words hang. "It was not revenge, though grievances existed. It was a need to control, to prove, perhaps even to herself, that she could guide events to her own ends without interference. The murder, the bell, the disappearance, the staged assault, all were instruments in a larger design, a demonstration of skill and authority." Mrs. Hawthorne's hands tightened in her lap, her composure faltering completely now. Miss Marple leaned forward, voice low but clear. "You wanted to create certainty where uncertainty should prevail. You desired dominance over perception itself, shaping reality so that others would doubt their own observations. And when the bell, the evidence, and Edward's presence threatened to disrupt that control, you acted to reassert it, carefully, methodically." The room was silent, save for the faint crackle of the fire. Mrs. Hawthorne's gaze dropped, her face, a mixture of resignation and defiance, the mask she had worn so carefully now crumbling. Edward remained frozen, the vicar silent but tense, and Miss Marple felt the satisfying clarity of revelation settling around them. The motive had been hidden in plain sight, obscured not by cunning alone, but by the psychological subtlety of someone who had always measured the world according to their own meticulous standards. Miss Marple leaned back in her chair, allowing the revelation to take hold. The crimes had been extreme, yes, but they were the logical extension of a mind obsessed with control, a mind that could no longer tolerate imperfection or unpredictability. And now, finally, the dangerous illusion had been stripped away, exposing the full scope of intention and the psychology that had driven events from the shadows. Miss Marple spent the following morning quietly preparing the household for what she knew would be the final reckoning. She did not speak of her plan, she merely arranged the parlour, subtly placing the remaining bells and ornaments in positions she knew would attract attention, while keeping her own observations unobtrusive. The household went about its routine, unaware that a carefully orchestrated test was about to unfold, a test that would leave the villain with no room to maneuver. By mid-afternoon, the vicar, Edward and Mrs. Hawthorne were gathered in the parlour, under the pretence of a casual tea. Miss Marple sat with her knitting, projecting calm and routine, but every detail was deliberate. The ribbons were subtly aligned, the bells arranged to draw the eye, and the door to the study slightly ajar. A silent invitation. She allowed a few moments to pass, letting the tension build naturally, observing the slight tremors in Mrs. Hawthorne's hands and the way Edward's gaze shifted nervously from the sideboard to the hearth. Finally she spoke, her vow, ice soft but carrying the authority of accumulated insight. "It seems, dear Mrs. Hawthorne, that we have overlooked one small but telling element in our investigations." She gestured vaguely toward the sideboard. Objects placed with care can reveal far more than words, and yet not every observer recognizes the significance of a seemingly trivial detail. Mrs. Hawthorne's lips pressed tightly together. She shifted in her chair, betraying an uncharacteristic unease. Edward glanced at her, his own anxiety mirrored in her rigid posture. The vicar sat with his hands clasped, silently waiting, perhaps unsure of what to expect. Miss Marple continued, letting her words settle into the room like a slow, deliberate rhythm. "You see, the bell, the ribbons, the careful placement of ornaments, all of these were instruments in a design intended to manipulate perception and conceal truth. And yet, even the most meticulous plan contains its own weakness, human nature itself." She paused, letting the weight of observation fall upon Mrs. Hawthorne, whose hands now fidgeted with her gloves. "Mrs. Hawthorne," Miss Marple said, lifting her gaze directly to her, "it is clear to me now that the desire to control, to orchestrate events according to your own exacting standards, led you to acts of grave consequence. The first murder, the attempted misdirection with the bell, the assault on Mr. Randall, they were all calculated, yet each left a subtle, unavoidable trace." The room seemed to shrink in intensity as Mrs. Hawthorne's composure cracked further. Her eyes darted toward the sideboard, toward the scattered ornaments, and finally back to Miss Marple. I don't understand what you mean," she stammered, though the tremor in her voice betrayed her. Miss Marple leaned forward, voice gentle but unyielding. "You can choose to speak, or you can allow your actions and the traces you left to speak for you. Each hesitation, each flicker of the eye, has already told me more than a confession ever could." The tension in the parlour thickened, Edward shifting uneasily, the vicar glancing toward the door as though an escape might present itself. Mrs. Hawthorne rose suddenly, a desperate movement, her hand reaching toward the mantel as if to grab an object for leverage. But Miss Marple, calm and precise, had anticipated the gesture. She had positioned herself so that there was no path for sudden movement, no opportunity for impulsive action. "You see, there is nowhere to hide," Miss Marple said quietly yet firmly. "The traces, the ribbons, the small inconsistencies, they have guided us here, and now the choice is yours. Speak the truth, or allow it to emerge in ways far less pleasant." For a heartbeat, silence reigned. Then, slowly, Mrs. Hawthorne sank back into her chair. The fight leaving her posture, she exhaled sharply. The confession began haltingly, piecing together the meticulous orchestration, the psychological need for control, and the careful manipulation of others. She admitted to every step, from the murder of Sir Lionel to the placement and removal of the bell, even to the staged assault on Mr. Randall. Each word, each reluctant admission, was a release of the tension that had gripped the household for days. Edward's shoulders relaxed, the vicar's hands unclasped, and Miss Marple leaned back in her chair, knitting needles resting in her lap. The confrontation had unfolded perfectly, each element anticipated and accounted for. The criminal, exposed and cornered, had revealed not just the acts themselves, but the underlying psychology that had driven them. The danger, the misdirection, and the subtle manipulation, all were laid bare. Miss Marple allowed herself a small, faint smile. The pieces were in place, the truth illuminated, and the household, though shaken, could at last begin to recover. The parlour had settled into a tense quiet, the household absorbing the weight of Mrs. Hawthorne's confession. Edward slouched in his chair, exhausted from days of anxiety, while the vicar exhaled as if releasing the accumulated tension of the past week. Miss Marple sat calmly, her knitting idle, observing the room with her habitual patience. The case, it seemed, had reached its conclusion. The manipulations, the psychological games, the meticulous orchestration, all pointed to Mrs. Hawthorne as the architect. Yet even as she listened to the confessions, a small unease nagged at her, a faint inconsistency in the rhythm of events, a note she could not yet place. Her attention drifted to the sideboard again. The ornaments were slightly askew, though Mrs. Hawthorne had carefully realigned them during her confession. And yet, one object caught Miss Marple's eye, a small, nearly invisible scrap of paper tucked behind a porcelain figurine. She lifted it delicately, unfolding it. On it was a brief, hurriedly scrawled note he saw too much. "Don't trust the obvious." Miss Marple's mind clicked into motion. The note was recent, its paper warm to the touch from having been handled, and the handwriting, though hurried, was familiar in a way that made her pulse quicken. It was not Mrs. Hawthorne's. The subtle loops and precise slants were Edward's, an observation she had not considered seriously before. He had been nervous, yes, but never seemed capable of the same calculated manipulation she had attributed solely to Mrs. Hawthorne. Yet this note suggested foresight, even warning, in a way that demanded further scrutiny. She looked across the room, her eyes narrowing slightly, letting her attention linger on Edward. "Edward," she said gently, voice calm but probing, "I wonder if you could explain this scrap of paper I just disc. Overd, it seems to indicate that someone was aware of matters they should not have been. Do you recognize it?" Edward's face paled, his eyes widening. He hesitated, as if caught between instinct and reason. I found it," he stammered, "just before everything happened. I didn't know what to do with it. I thought Mrs. Hawthorne might have written it to scare me. I didn't think—" His voice faltered, the truth dangling on the edge of revelation. Miss Marple's gaze was steady, unyielding. "Yet you handled it, kept it to yourself, and allowed events to unfold according to her plan. Did you act out of fear, or was there something else?" Edward swallowed hard, the room silent except for the faint ticking of the mantel clock. I wanted to see it through," he admitted finally, voice trembling. "I didn't want anyone to know I suspected more than she admitted. I thought maybe I could fix it before anyone noticed." The revelation sent a ripple of shock through the vicar and Mrs. Hawthorne. Her own eyes, previously clouded with guilt, widened as she realized the extent to which another mind had been quietly active in the shadows. Miss Marple, however, remained serene, her mind racing but controlled. The case, she realized, had not been entirely resolved with the confession alone. Edward's hidden awareness, his subtle intervention, or non-intervention, revealed that the narrative she had constructed, though accurate in its essentials, had overlooked a secondary layer of influence, a second set of intentions operating quietly alongside the primary crime. Miss Marple's next words were measured, each syllable precise. "So the story we believe complete is, in fact, twofold. Mrs. Hawthorne's orchestration was evident, but someone else has been observing, anticipating, and perhaps manipulating events in subtle ways to protect themselves or to test the bounds of our understanding. That, Edward, would be you?" Edward nodded reluctantly, the weight of acknowledgement settling over him. "I didn't interfere. I only tried to manage the consequences," he admitted. "I never meant for it to go this far, for anyone to get hurt." Miss Marple's keen gaze softened just slightly, though her mind remained alert. She now understood the full complexity, a primary perpetrator driven by a need for control, and a secondary actor, equally intelligent but motivated by fear and cautious intervention. The case was no longer a straightforward matter of guilt and confession. It was a delicate interplay of observation, manipulation, and human psychology. The parlour held its breath as Miss Marple finally allowed herself a small smile. The genius of the investigation had been tested to its limits, revealing not only the true motive of the first criminal, but also the hidden influence of another mind, working quietly. In parallel, the final twist was both surprising and inevitable, a reminder that in the delicate web of human actions, even the most careful calculations could conceal unexpected complexity. The case, at last, was complete, but only because every hidden layer, every subtle deviation, had been observed, understood, and brought into the light. The late afternoon sunlight slanted through the tall parlour windows, catching the dust motes in a golden haze. Miss Marple remained seated in her chair, knitting forgotten in her lap, her sharp eyes sweeping the room. The confession from Mrs. Hawthorne had seemed sufficient, yet Edward's reluctant revelation had altered the frame of the entire investigation. Now the question remained: justice, true justice, required that the full extent of events be recognized, not merely the most visible culprit. The constable, flustered and uncertain, had gathered the household around the sideboard once again, seeking to impose official order. "We have the confession," he said, voice quivering slightly, "and the facts appear clear. The case—" Miss Marple held up a hand, cutting him off with quiet authority. "Facts, dear constable, are only as reliable as the observer who collects them. And in this household many things were observed but misunderstood." She allowed the pause to settle before continuing. "The bell's disappearance was not merely an act of misdirection, it was the first signal of manipulation, a breadcrumb left to probe reactions. The ribbons, the ornaments, the apparent chaos, all were instruments of Mrs. Hawthorne's need for control." Edward shifted uncomfortably, his earlier confession still a burden, but Miss Marple's gaze softened ever so slightly toward him. "And yet," she said, someone else, quietly attentive, observed the unfolding pattern. "You, Edward, recognized irregularities and chose caution rather than confrontation. That awareness, though unspoken, prevented even greater misfortune, though it also concealed truth from those who sought it openly." Mrs. Hawthorne, seated stiffly, visibly paled as Miss Marple outlined the intricate web of actions and counteractions. Every subtle twitch she had displayed, every tremor of the hand, had been noted and stored in Miss Marple's keen memory. The confession alone accounted for what had been visible, but the detective now revealed the invisible currents that had guided the household's responses. "The real brilliance, if I may say so, lies in how small details were manipulated," Miss Marple continued. "The bell, seemingly trivial, acted as a psychological lever. The red ribbon left behind was both a clue and a diversion. Each step was designed to mislead, to create a narrative that would satisfy casual observation while obscuring true intent. And yet, even in its perfection, a tiny thread remained unaccounted for. Edward's own caution and observation." The constable's brow furrowed, struggling to process the dual culpability and the subtle interventions. Miss Marple leaned back, voice calm but firm, tracing the web of events with careful precision. "Justice, in this case, is complex. Mrs. Hawthorne must answer for the acts she committed with deliberate intent. Edward, however, though he bears responsibility for concealment, acted under duress and the weight of fear. The law may see his actions differently, but it is important to recognize the layers of human behavior that intersected here." Mrs. Hawthorne's eyes dropped, resignation in every line of her face. Edward remained tense, but relief mixed with his anxiety, the burden of concealment now partially lifted. Miss Marple allowed herself a brief smile, acknowledging that the case, while legally intricate, was morally illuminated. Then, with a measured gesture, she turned to the constable. "The clues that were missed by routine investigation, those that seemed insignificant or coincidental, were the very keys to understanding the entire sequence. The bell, the ribbons, the placement of ornaments, even the offhand comments made during tea and mass, all were signals overlooked because they were assumed trivial, and yet they revealed a meticulous mind and the interplay of a second, cautious observer. That, dear constable, is why careful observation is always worth more than assumption." The room fell silent as her words settled. Outside, the wind rustled through the snow-laden trees, a reminder that even as the surface calm returned, life retained its subtle uncertainties. Miss Marple watched the household absorb the truth, each individual processing their role in a delicate, human drama. Justice had been delivered where it could, yet the complexity of human motives lingered, leaving a sense of unfinished business in the air, a reminder that truth is rarely neat, and that awareness, patience, and perception are always the finest instruments for those who seek it. As the vicar finally rose to offer thanks for Miss Marple's guidance, she remained seated, eyes still attentive, already cataloguing the minor details that would remain quietly with her. The case was concluded, but the shadows of human nature, the hidden impulses, the subtle manipulations, remained, and in that lingering uncertainty she found both satisfaction and the inexhaustible challenge of understanding the world, one small clue at a time. The household had quieted into an uneasy calm. The confessions, the unravelling of hidden motives, and the careful explanations had settled the immediate storm of events. But Miss Marple, standing near the window and observing the fading light over the snow-laden garden, felt the familiar tug of unease, the subtle awareness that even a resolved case rarely closes the B.O. "Okay, entirely." The vicar and Edward lingered in the parlour, exchanging whispers about next steps and legal proceedings, while Mrs. Hawthorn had been escorted discreetly to her room, subdued yet unrepentant in the way only a person accustomed to control could be. Miss Marple allowed herself a small smile, not of triumph, but of quiet satisfaction. The intricate puzzle had been unravelled, the hidden threads identified, the psychology behind each act laid bare. And yet, in the recesses of her mind, one detail continued to press insistently, a whisper of uncertainty she could not dismiss. It was the note, the small scrap of paper Edward had handled but never disclosed until prompted. The words, "He saw too much. Don't trust the obvious," lingered like an echo in her thoughts. The phrasing was curious, deliberate, almost too careful, and the word he, the deliberate pronoun, suggested a reference to someone specific, someone whose awareness might extend beyond Edward's cautious observations. Miss Marple had accounted for the main players, but the note hinted at another presence, subtle and unseen, watching the unfolding events and perhaps leaving cryptic warnings. She turned to the sideboard, her eyes sweeping over the ornaments and the remaining bells, now restored to their proper positions. Everything appeared orderly, almost quaint in its domesticity, yet Miss Marple's experience told her that appearances could be deceiving. The red ribbon, the small alignment of objects, the traces of foot traffic across the tiles, all had been meticulously noted and catalogued. Still, the minor inconsistencies remained. A faint smudge on the mantel, a barely noticeable shift in a picture frame, the lingering sense that something had been moved, but without leaving any obvious clue. Miss Marple exhaled softly, feeling the subtle thrill of curiosity that never truly dissipates for a detective. This was the nature of her work. A solution could be reached, yet the world always contained the seeds of another puzzle, a shadow that had not yet stepped fully into the light. The seemingly minor details she had catalogued now hinted at potential stories untold, threads that might someday be followed, and minds that were cleverer, or at least more cautious, than even those immediately before her. As she prepared to leave, Miss Marple cast a final glance around the parlour. Edward stood near the doorway, still pale but recovering composure. The vicar adjusted a cushion with distracted hands, and Mrs. Hawthorn, unseen behind her closed door, remained a quiet enigma, her inner machinations hidden behind a veneer of guilt and propriety. The house, now calm, was alive with the echoes of events, each footstep, glance, and minor tremor preserved in memory like a map of human complexity. Walking toward the front door, Miss Marple reflected that even in cases that appeared solved, the human mind left traces beyond the grasp of immediate comprehension. A note here, a glance there, a hesitated word, small details that might seem inconsequential could, in another time, reveal new connections, new motives, new mysteries. And that was the enduring truth of her work. Solving one problem never truly ended the story. It merely prepared the mind to perceive the next subtle deviation from the ordinary. Outside, the winter wind stirred the snow, sending a flurry across the pathway leading to the gate. Miss Marple paused for a moment, feeling the crisp air and the quiet hush of the village settling into the evening. The case was complete in the sense that justice had been served where it could, the truth illuminated for those involved. Yet, as she glanced back at the vicarage, a flicker of thought danced through her mind. An unplaced shadow, a cryptic message, a trace of human behaviour that suggested one small question remained unanswered. She smiled faintly to herself and began her walk back toward the village, her steps steady, her mind alert. The snow crunched softly beneath her feet, and the lights of the cottages twinkled warmly in the distance. Yet Miss Marple knew that behind every resolved crime, every confession, there remained the possibility of another ripple, another hidden pattern waiting to be uncovered. A mystery never truly ends, she reflected. It merely waits for the observer willing to notice what others pass by. And Miss Marple, always watchful, was more than willing.